Dr. G. She is an architect and a landscape architect by training. She holds a PhD in design and planning from University of Colorado, Denver, USA. She has 20 years of teaching and research experience in the fields of architecture, landscape architecture, and planning. She has worked in many prestigious institutions including School of Architecture and Planning, Anna University, and College of Architecture and Planning, University of Colorado, Boulder, and Denver. She is currently a professor and a PG program coordinator in the Department of Architecture at Satyabama University. She has been selected as the best graduating student of Center for Environmental Planning and Technology in Landscape Architecture program for the year 1994 to 1995. She has also received the B.V. Bhagwat Memorial Award. Apart from all this, she is a fellow member of the Indian Society of Landscape Architects.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series for BArch program. This is the 6th lecture to the course AR 6009 Landscape and Ecology. In this lecture, we will discuss the contents of Unit 3 Garden Design. The third unit focuses on landscape and garden design in history, and in this unit we will be learning about Japanese gardens, Italian Renaissance gardens, and Mughal gardens in India. In the last lecture we discussed about Japanese garden. In this lecture we will discuss about Italian Renaissance gardens. Under Italian Renaissance gardens we will discuss about the various design principles and the components of the Renaissance gardens. They are broadly grouped under 3 categories: water, stonework, and evergreens, and we will also be looking at some examples. Now, to understand the Italian Renaissance garden, let us try to understand the mind of the Renaissance people. First, we will look at the timeline. You might be familiar with this timeline because you would have already discussed about history of architecture. Fall of the Roman Empire happened sometime in the 4th century BC. Now, to understand the Renaissance mind, let us look at the timeline. You might be familiar with this timeline. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages began. During the Middle Ages, the people focused inwardly, the culture focused inwards, but towards the end of the 14th century, the new discoveries and discovery of new lands happened. As a result, people started questioning the assumptions about how the world worked. So, as a result, they started questioning, or the focus of the enquiry shifted. During the Middle Ages, the focus of enquiry was more on the next world or on the nature of God or of heaven, whereas during the Renaissance period, people focused on the present context of earthly life and also on social and political relationship of the real world. As a result, people's view of nature changed. So, they believed that divine could be perceived in the order of nature, and gardens could be composed to express that order, and landscapes could be appreciated for their scenic value. Geographically also, the Italian peninsula benefited from the connection to both east and west, and during that time independent city states were established in Italy. A city state is a region that is independently ruled by a major city. Examples of such city states include Florence, Naples, and Venice, and these city states had their own government, and Florence is where the Renaissance first began, and because of the city states, identities were defined regionally and power resided with wealthy families. And the wealth of the Italian city state played an important role in the Renaissance. The wealth allowed prominent families to support artists, scientists, and philosophers, encouraging new ideas and artistic movements. So, similar to Renaissance art and architecture, the Italian Renaissance garden emerged from the rediscovery of classical Roman models. So, the designers looked back to the Roman Empire for inspiration and guidance. So, essentially during the Renaissance period, people's view of nature changed. So, the gardens were designed, they focused outward, and they were intended for pleasure of the view of the garden and the landscape beyond, and for the enjoyment of the sights, sounds, and smells of the garden itself. So, the predominant form of the garden type was a country villa and it was purely designed for pleasure. So, we can say that the essential character of the Renaissance garden lies mainly in the attitude of the life of its creators. Now, let us look at the various design principles of Renaissance gardens. There are many factors that influence the Renaissance gardens. One such influence is writings of Alberti. His 10 books of architecture was based on the writings of Pliny and Vitruvius, and he came up with theories of site selection and planning. He suggested a well drained site on a solid ground for the construction of villa, and orientation of the site to the sun angles and the prevailing winds needs to be considered, because the site needs to get cooling summer breezes and it needs to be protected from the harsh winter winds, and adequacy of water supply needs to be determined. He also proposed many principles for designing the gardens. So, the villa should be sited on gentle elevations with the view of the surrounding countryside. He recommended terrace and stairways. To overcome the difficulties of uneven terrain. An avenue or axis was also recommended by him to link all the elements and spaces. Porticos were suggested to make garden space continuous with that of the surrounding. Following these principles, the typical Italian Renaissance garden followed these principles. So, the sites were selected along the hilly slopes. The sites overlooked the adjoining city from the slopes. Both view and wind were important consideration. So, many descending terraces were carved out on these slopes. As a result, a series of garden roofs projecting into the space was designed. Axial planning was one of the main principles. So, in Renaissance gardens, sequence of geometric spaces were laid out and they were linked by a common axis. And here in this Italian Renaissance garden itself was considered as part of the house. In the simplest form, it was regarded as an extra room. For example, it was almost considered as a saloon flooded with unlimited light and air. Now, let us look at the layout. The layout suggested that of a miniature town. You have long avenues and walks, and they were interrupted with open squares and cross avenues, and the crossings were accentuated by fountains or some kind of open spaces with stonework. Next, we will look at the different components of Italian Renaissance gardens. They are broadly categorized under 3 categories. They are water. Next, we will discuss about the various components of Italian Renaissance gardens. We will be discussing about these components under 3 categories: water, sculpture and stonework, and evergreens. We will start with water. Water was everywhere in the Italian gardens. Water was used extravagantly, and it was also used to suggest coolness. Water was used in different ways. This is a typical section of a Italian garden. So, every pause in the ascent of the hillside garden was marked by a new and varied use of water. For example, reflecting pools or fish ponds were used at the lowermost level, and they were used for peace and also for rest. Whereas, glittering water cascade was used as the ascent begins, and in this case the splashing and roaring water was used for its sound. And monumental fountains were generally located on the topmost terrace of the garden, and the design depended on the volume of the water available, and generally they were enclosed within garden rooms. So, here we see some pictures of the pools. These were used at the lower level of the garden. Here is a picture of water cascade, here is a water chain, and water was used as fountains at the topmost terrace. And water was also used for its technical brilliance. Water was used with technical brilliance to delight and surprise visitors. There was no sense of water being used functional, or it was being treated with reverence. It was used with technical brilliance to delight and surprise the visitors. For example, hydraulic features were used not only for creating visually interesting water features, they were also used for acoustical purposes. So, acoustically active devices were used. For example, Fountain of Owl in Villa d'Este is an example for acoustical use of water. here the water organ produces the birds chirping sounds. Water tricks were another important element in Renaissance gardens. So, water jets were splashed on to the unsuspecting guest in many cases. For example, in one of the garden, the spouts were hidden in the ground, and when the visitor accidentally steps on the triggering mechanism, jets of water shoots out and it drenches the visitor. The next element is the sculpture. During the Renaissance period, ruins of classical Rome was examined with new attention. As a result, old ancient sculptures were unearthed, and people started displaying that in the gardens against the dark green foliage of the gardens. So, the notion that garden was a setting in which white marble figures should be seen against the dark green foliage was firmly fixed in the minds of all patrons. Sculptures in the gardens were also integrated with fountains or staircases or also in the garden walls. Stoneworks were another important element. As we see here, huge pots were displayed in the gardens, and stoneworks also include steps and staircases. Architecture formed the structural basis of many of the garden features. So, retaining walls, pathways and monumental staircases were became important in Renaissance gardens. The next element is use of evergreens. Evergreens were mainly used for shade and also for a sense of coolness, because glare in the sky called for cool tones. As a result, flowers were avoided in Italian gardens. So, plants were used in many different forms such as parterres, clipped hedges, avenues and boscos. We will look at examples for these elements now. Parterre. What is a parterre? It's a term used to define ground plane composed of patterned garden beds, something like this. So, here a pattern on ground is woven with low shrubs, and they are primarily evergreen, and these patterns are created primarily to be viewed from above, and many times it was simple, or in later cases they became very intricate and formal. Here is a view of a parterre in an Italian Renaissance garden. Another view of the same parterre, we can see the intricate patterns formed with low shrubs. In this connection, I want to introduce another word, topiary. Topiary is the art of training plants into intricate or stylized shapes and forms, and parterre is an example. And typically evergreen shrubs and trees are used because they remain the same throughout the year. The next element is the hedge. Compactly planted shrub or low growing trees with dense foliage that is clipped to form a solid wall is known as a hedge, and these hedges can act as a boundary or screen, and such hedges were used extensively in Italian Renaissance gardens. And evergreen trees were another important element. Evergreen trees were a dominant element in bosco. Bosco is basically a wooded grove within the garden. As we see here, this is a formal garden and there is a bosco around it. So, these wooded areas surround the garden enclosure and they act as buffers, and these boscos also symbolize the sacred woods and gardens of earlier Rome. The next element of planting is the cypress avenues. Avenues carry the eye practically over unlimited distance in the Italian Renaissance gardens. So, avenues and vistas were important part of the garden, and generally such avenues originated or culminated in the house. It originated or culminated in the house, and sometimes the focus was a fountain or a grotto. Along with avenues, I want to discuss about another technique used by the Italian garden designers. That is, they understood the effect of perspectives and they used it to increase the dramatic qualities of a view. For example, generally two parallel rows of trees are used to create avenues, but in some gardens purposely the perspective was distorted, because here the effect of distance was obtained by gradual closing in of the elements. So, we can see that in this example the view of this garden is here. So, here the elements, it is not parallel, it is gradually closes in, and this increases the effect of distance. And perspectives were also falsified for dramatic effects. For example, cascades were widened towards the top. So, in this case, when a visitor looks from above, an effect of added distance is obtained, whereas from below it exaggerates the steepness and brings the top very much nearer. So, we discussed about the various elements of Italian Renaissance gardens and also some of the techniques that were used by the garden designers. Now, we will look at examples. We will start with Villa Medici Fiesole. Villa Medici is considered as a prototype garden for Italian Renaissance garden, because as we see here, it follows all the design principles. The site is selected on a sloping site and it has a commanding view of the nearby countryside, and there are many terraces and we can see porticos and pergolas. Here is the plan of Villa Medici. The garden has 3 terraces. This is the topmost terrace, and the second terrace has pergolas, and the third terrace is more formal. The entrance is at the topmost terrace, and at the second level from the pergola one can go to the secret garden. Now, let us look at the views now. So, this is the view of the garden, and we can see the buildings, and this is located on a sloping site, and we can see the 3 terraces. So, in the topmost terrace along the hillside, for the entire length of the terrace, there are rose beds and lemon trees. So, here is the view of the garden of the topmost terrace, and here is another view, and in the center of this edge we see a fountain, and the fountain is decorated with stone and stucco, and this fountain is the beginning point of the central axis here. And this is the view of the second terrace, and we can see the pergola, and from the second terrace one can go to the secret garden. And the third level we have a very formal garden, and this can be accessed from the pergola through a staircase, and what we see here is a view of the secret garden, that is at the second level. And now we see the lower garden. So, this lower garden can be accessed from the second level through a staircase, as we see here, and we can see elements, water elements, and can also see a parterre. So, this is a formal garden. So, this is this was designed during the beginning of Renaissance period, and it has all the elements of a typical Renaissance garden. So, more than a working form, this garden was considered as a setting for intellectual life and demonstration of aesthetic and ideological values, that it can be considered as a prototype garden for Italian Renaissance period. Next, we will discuss about gardens in Villa d'Este. Here is a view of the garden. So, the garden is located on a sloping site. It slopes from back to the front and also from side to side, and the garden was laid out geometrically in a grid like fashion, and walkways divide the hillside into many bands, as we see here, and all the elements are arranged along a central axis, and there are also 3 cross axes. The first one is a cardinal axis, that is very close to the residence. The second cross axis is wall of the 100 fountains, and the third axis is along the fish pools at the lower terrace. The garden was designed to be toward from the lowermost point and upward. However, the grid plan here and the plan offers a choice of paths and a variety of experiences. So, there are many choices available, and this is a view of Villa d'Este gardens. In this view, the water features are highlighted. As we see here, there are many water features, and there is a central axis, and there are also cross axes. Now, let us tour this garden. we will start from the lowermost point. This is the view of the garden from the entrance. We can see the pergolas and the distant water elements. From the lower level, the first cross axis is formed by water parterre. So, the fish ponds are located here, and this is the view of the fish ponds, and this actually starts from the organ of fountains. This first major cross axis starts from the fountain of organ fountain, and this organ fountain produces the sound of trumpets, and this is the view of the fishing ponds from the organ fountain. Here is another view of the organ fountain. The second axis is formed along the wall of 100 fountains. In this case, 3 parallel ducts are arranged at 3 different levels, and they symbolically represents 3 tributaries of the river, and this particular axis links the oval fountain at one end and the Rometa complex on the other side. So, this is the view of the oval fountain. It is also known as fountain of Tivoli. On top of this oval fountain, there is a Pegasus fountain, and there is also a walkway. This is considered as an ideal place to linger around on a hot day. And on the other end of this axis is Rometa, or a symbolic Rome. This Rometa has miniature composition of all the important temples and structures of ancient Rome. This was created mainly because this from the building, the view towards Rome was hidden. The building had commanding view of the garden and also also view of the countryside, whereas view towards the Rome was hidden. So, this was the Rometa, or a symbolic Rome was created to be viewed from the loggias of the residence. And in the center we have a dragon fountain. This is the topmost axis, the cardinal's walk, and from here we can see the view of the garden. We can see the axis and avenues. So, we looked at the important water features in Italian Renaissance garden, but there are many other interesting small water features. So, it can be considered as one of the most full featured water gardens of its time. In addition to water elements, water devices were used for making sounds and powering of mechanical movements. For example, is the fountain of owls. In this particular fountain, water pressure forces the dozens of mechanical birds to chirp, and then an owl appears. So, such hydraulic features were incorporated in the gardens. So, we looked at the important elements of Villa d'Este. There are many other interesting features, and we learned that it is all the elements are organized around the major central axis and the cross axis. We can say that it is a wonderful garden to explore and admire, not only for its beautiful elements, it is also for its amazing engineering that was necessary for the construction. Okay. So, the next we will discuss about Villa Lante. Here is a view of the Villa Lante. This has 2 elements, both a formal garden and a park. The park has fountains, buildings, and also straight lanes linking various elements, and the formal garden is terraced and it has a central axis along which many other elements are organized. So, here is a plan of the formal garden. There is a central axis along which all the elements are organized. This is a view of both the park and the formal garden. There are 2 viewing sequences possible in this garden. One is an entrance through the park gate, and the other one is through the parterre gate. So, when one enters through a park gate, they can travel through the lanes, walk through the lanes of the park, and then they can reach the top of the formal garden, and then the visitor can enjoy the garden by descending down the various staircases. Whereas, when a visitor enters through a parterre gate, they first enjoy the lowermost terrace, then they climb to enjoy the other features of the garden. So, in this case, when the visitor uses the park gate and reaches the topmost point of the formal garden, the visitor experiences an evolution from unspoiled nature to a geometrically ordered flower beds. Whereas, if a visitor uses the parterre gate, then he climbs up. In this case, he experiences the height of the civilization and artistry, and then travels to a time of unspoiled nature and man living in the golden age. That is, the experience is reversed. Here is a view of the formal garden with its parterre at the lower level and all the other water features. Now, we will start from the park gate and travel through this garden and look at the various features. So, when one enters through the park gate, first we see here the fountain of Pegasus. Such features were also found in Villa d'Este. This is one of the common feature of Italian Renaissance garden. So, after passing the fountain of Pegasus through the lanes, the visitor can reach the topmost point of the terrace, and from here one can see the garden, and this plan suggests that there is a central axis and all the architectural features are in pairs and they are distributed on either side. For example, here is a pavilion and there are dining halls here. So, architectural elements are in pairs and they are distributed on either side of the central axis. So, the central axis is used mainly for water features, and as seen in this section, the difference in level between the lower terrace and the upper terrace is around 50 feet, and we can see that many terraces are formed here. So, from in the topmost terrace, when a visitor arrives, first he encounters a fountain of deluge or fountain of flood. This is flanked on either side by dining pavilions or logias of the muses, and here is the fountain of deluge. And in this dining pavilions, on the eaves some water jets are fitted. Again, this is a part of the water trick, and below this fountain of deluge there is fountain of dolphins, and this fountain is enclosed by box hedges, as we can see here, and next to it we have a water chain. This water chain links the fountain of dolphins and the fountain of giants that is placed next. This has certain symbolic meaning. Water symbolizes untouched nature, and the chain form here exercises complete control over the water. Thus, this entire arrangement symbolizes civilizing of nature by art. So, this particular water chain element is used to link two important fountains, the fountain of dolphins and the fountain of giants. So, next we will look at the fountain of giants. This particular fountain has two sculptures, that is the statues of Tiber and Arno river, and this again symbolizes the fertility that water brings to the land. And in the middle of the next terrace, we found there is a fountain of the table or stone dining table, as we see here. The central trough has water. The water flows through the central trough. Here some more views of the fountain of the table, and this central trough is used for cooling beverages and also for floating the food. And next we have the fountain of lights. This fountain of lights has upper concave steps and then lower convex steps. This has around 160 small jets, and these jets shoots water upwards, and this almost links the second terrace to the lower terrace. So, in the lower terrace we have parterres, there is water parterre and also shrub parterre. In the water parterre there are small stone boats, and these small stone boats fire jets of water towards the central fountain, that is the fountain of Moors. So, we looked at the important features of gardens. So, we looked at the important elements of Villa Lante, and the important principle is the central axis and also bilateral symmetry. So, with this we come to the end of the lecture. Let us just look at the important points. In this lecture we discussed about Italian Renaissance gardens, and we discussed the various design principles of the garden, and we discussed the components of the gardens under three headings: water, sculpture and stonework, and evergreens. And we looked at three important examples of Renaissance gardens. The They are Villa Medici, Villa d'Este and Villa Lante. Now, we will look at some questions that you will be able to answer based on this lecture. Give examples of any two garden representatives of the Italian Renaissance style. Discuss with suitable example the principles of landscape design in an Italian Renaissance garden. Explain the following: parterre, bosco, topiary. Write a short note on secret garden. Explain the features of an Italian Renaissance garden with a typical example. Thank you.